Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, Fanny Price, the heroine. Thinking about Fanny Price, continuation. As I said in the first video about Fanny, she's a heroine that many readers struggle to enjoy. And this is partly due to the literary conventions and expectations that readers have of a heroine or a hero at the centre of a novel or story of any kind. Jane Austen overturns quite a number of the conventional expectations that we might have of who or what a heroine should be. There are some ways in which this novel conforms to long-standing concepts that occur in storytelling. The traditional story of the orphan or the foundling, the outsider who is on a journey, a route of self-discovery towards social acceptance in the arena where they find themselves. This is, of course, Fanny's story. She's not exactly an orphan, she's not exactly a foundling, but she's certainly displaced as an individual, and she has to work hard at learning the ways and the customs. She has to work hard at catching up on her education and her upbringing, her etiquette, in order to fit in with the Bertram family and to find acceptance there. She has to overcome her feelings of homesickness. She has to be very strong in being cut off completely from her birth family, of whom naturally she has been very fond. The story of Fanny also is the story of the ugly duckling growing into the swan. So again, this is a traditional fairy story that speaks for itself in many respects, but it's one that is applied to Fanny as well. It's the Cinderella story also, and all three of these stories in fairy tale or traditional tale contexts have a degree of parity. The Cinderella story, the rags to riches, or in Fanny's case, the from rags to vastly improved social status story, is another common storytelling theme into which Fanny does definitely fit. It's confusing to the reader's expectations when the heroine who plays this role of the orphan, the swan, the emerging swan, Cinderella, it's difficult for the reader, especially the modern reader, who has so much experience of reading and storytelling through television, through film, in addition to a wide range of comparatively, by comparison with ever before in our history, very cheap written materials to engage with. It's very confusing for the reader when the heroine of these different plots isn't strong, beautiful, vigorous, full of life. Fanny is, by contrast, isn't she? She's weak and sickly. We're not sure as readers whether she's going to make it, let alone triumph into becoming the swan, or whether she'll actually ever find acceptance of the Mansfield Park. Of course, this is part of the journey, but it's it's almost, will she survive to do these things? Will she have enough energy to do these things? Not just is she capable of figuring out how to overcome the trial, but is she actually, in terms of her health, capable of doing so? And again, as she meets these different trials and tribulations that she has, these different challenges that she's faced with, how realistic does it seem, especially to the modern reader, that a timid, shrinking, passive style of engagement is actually going to overcome any of these issues? In today's world, we're much more inclined to think that bravura, false confidence, blowing our own trumpet, generally faking it until we make it, is what's going to get us through the toughest hurdles in life. It's certainly what's vaunted. It's certainly what is put forward as a desirable characteristic in a great many of the heroes and heroines whom we see on the screen. And even those people who are held up as heroes in society. It's true even of sporting heroes. It doesn't matter particularly much nowadays if a sporting hero has behaved unsportingly, if they've cheated or if they've committed a foul. Well, they take the penalty, they pay the price, and then they move on, nothing daunted. And once you've undergone the penance, then, oh, that's fine, you just come back as before. However, those kind of values haven't always prevailed. It has been in the past, it certainly would have been at this period, that if you made serious mistakes with regard to your integrity, that you're probably finished for the rest of your life, in terms of being able to make good again or to advance in any way where society would expect you to, have standards of good conduct. So for the contemporary reader, Fanny might not have been as engaging a heroine as, say, the lively Elizabeth Bennet, but she would have been a heroine to whom they could relate and for whom they would have had a considerable understanding. Another difficult thing with regard to Fanny as the heroine, and it relates to all of what has just been said, is that Fanny's actions do not drive the plot. Fanny is really always at the receiving ends of other people's actions. She's always the one who has to make the decision of how she's going to respond. Now, again, this isn't really Fanny's fault. She's been put into this social position by the powers that be, the powers that have governed her life from a small child. She went to the Bertrams when she was only 9. And because of the much more rigid social codes that prevailed at this period, it's not really up to Fanny to be able to smash through and break and rebel against these restrictions that are placed on her life. The concept of the teenager hadn't really got going at this time. That was really since the 1950s. And the idea of being a rebel in your teens just as well really hadn't got going. And if Fanny had tried any of these tactics, any of these more modern day tactics, she'd have found herself really right back at Portsmouth. Or she would have found herself perhaps in a boarding school, or she might have found herself in the situation as she got older of being a parlour boarder in some kind of an establishment for young women who weren't really wanted anywhere else, most usually because they were illegitimate, as is the case for Harriet Smith in Emma. She's been at school, and now that she's left actually attending school, but she still lives at the school as a parlour boarder because she's illegitimate and she doesn't have a home to go to. And Fanny might have found herself placed in a similar sort of situation if she hadn't conformed to the place that was ascribed to her in the Bertram's household. So normally, with heroes, with heroines, a lot of the time their actions drive the plot and other people are responding to what they're doing, and they set up their own course towards their fulfillment and towards their happiness. Whereas Fanny's role is that of passive waiting, and of being patient. So again, qualities of the humble, lowly Christian, especially at a time when we might be looking at fundamental precepts of Christianity, when we might be being influenced by the revival of Puritanism, that's to say the evangelical Christian movement of the 19th century, which was beginning to get underway at this period. Fanny, despite this passivity, does undergo an evolution. She does undergo an epiphany. She does become more personally empowered, although she still remains spiritual and although she still remains well within the bounds of the ideal Christian woman for the period. She does begin to blossom a bit more in her character. She comes to know herself better. She comes to perceive the quiet strengths that lie within her, and that gives her greater confidence. By the end of the novel, I think that the more capable, the more rounded, and the more comfortable with engaging in social activities Fanny that we see is realistic. It's a very realistic characterization and development of the young Fanny that we've seen earlier on in the novel. Still, it is the characterization that's come through Watching and Waiting. It's the character fulfillment that's come through Watching and Waiting. It's the character fulfillment that has come through undergoing penance and trial and being patient. Of showing continual forbearance towards Mrs. Norris's personal essays against her at a very cutting personal level. Nevertheless, many readers do find Fanny's characterization a bit of an anticlimax. If we take a more open view of a novel, however, if we are perhaps a little bit more modern and a little bit more dynamic in the expectations that we have of how the action of a novel should proceed, we may be more open to the idea that a heroine can sit in the centre of a story and respond to what goes on around her, and yet nonetheless be a fully fledged, fully formed person. There are people like this. There are women like this. Historically, in European society, there would have been a great many more women like Fanny because of the restrictive codes that were laid onto young girls as they were growing up. And Jane Austen, typically of Jane Austen, has chosen to depict a woman who does not conform to the standard gender stereotyping of the era. All of her heroines fall outside a gender stereotypical ideal type of woman for the period, and I would suggest that there were a number of stereotypes at this period and throughout the 19th century for women in terms of literary characterization, which had some correlation to the product of the upbringing and education that was instilled into women. So it had some correlation with real women through the education and upbringing that they were given. And Fanny, in being the very Christian, the morally model young woman, moves away from the other characterizations that she probably have been given of being energetic and active in taking on projects to take care of other people and look after other people if she were the perfect Christian, and typically fictionalized heroine. But she doesn't. She is an introverted character that has arisen through her experiences, her life experiences, and Jane Austen brings forward this type of person and says, this person, this type of woman, as much as any other type of woman, is valid to be a heroine in fiction, is valid to be taken seriously in terms of her happiness and her fulfillment and the way in which people value her social contribution, just as any other person is. And this is one of the big strengths, one of the far-seeing aspects, and one of the extremely modern and fair-thinking aspects that pertains to Jane Austen's writing in this novel, as much as in all of her other novels.